What's up, my beautiful people? Welcome to the Benaiah podcast, a show that is wild, very wild. We are proudly Uganda's #1 conservation and tourism show, but we also benefit from a listenership from all across the African continent and the world at large. We try to put out a new episode every Sunday with discussions ranging around how to make the natural world a better place, creating awesome images, telling stories with words, wildlife films and photography, with occasional musings on sound and tech. If these topics fascinate you as much as they interest me, I promise you this podcast will have you in a spin. I do share a lot of my personal experiences, and from time to time, I'll have 1 or 2 guests on the podcast to have some very insightful discussions. So thank you so much for tuning in, and enjoy your time here. I need some help, and that help, I believe, will come from you. Welcome to the Benaiah podcast, and for those guys that have been not watching, those that have been accessing the podcast, thank you so much for supporting the show. We've been Uganda's #1 podcast for the last, I guess, close to 3 months, and it's all because of all the incredible work that you guys do in listening to the show, streaming the show, recommending it, sharing it with your friends. Now, I do have a bit of a challenge, and that's why I come on today. That's why I'm asking for some help, and I'll come to why I need that help in a bit. But let me just give us a bit of background. So, the podcast is currently in its audio form, and we've been doing quite well. I would probably say excellently well, but I don't know if that's an English word. But we've been having a bit of a chat with people that listen to the podcast, you guys, and also a few friends of mine about the possibility of making it a video podcast. Now, I'm one of those persons that are a bit of a perfectionist. So before I choose to go video, I need a few of the foundational things to be in place. So that's why we've taken a bit of time to go video, and of course we're still testing the waters. As I said, it's mainly been an audio podcast, and it's doing very well. It's still the #1 tourism and conservation podcast, and that's still going to be the case. We might still slide in a bit of tech and music as we go on, but we're still going to maintain it as a tourism and conservation podcast. Now, in light of making this a video podcast, as we've been discussing about getting a few things. Of course, the first package came. We got a couple of mics. We've been using some excellent mics. The only challenge with them is that there are different mics, and they do look different. They do sound different as well. And the challenge that poses is when we have guests on the podcast in a video form, then you don't really have a consistent look on the show. So we picked up a couple of mics, this being one. I've just remembered I should have put on a pop filter. But well, when you swing it, sometimes some things don't go to plan. So I guess that's a tip. If you are recording sound, voiceover, stuff like this, then maybe think of putting on a pop filter. Anyway, so we did pick up a couple of mics, this being one, and another package is coming of several other things that will help us get on board in light of making this a video podcast. Now, back to the reason why I asked for help. Number one, we are looking for a venue. So if you know of a nice looking place where we can shoot comfortably, freely, of course, a beautiful place where the visuals will look nice, please do hit me up in the comments. Well, I don't think we should use the comments. Use the email address. So I'll leave the email in the podcast description if you are listening to the podcast on any of the streaming platforms that we've been publishing to. And if if you're listening to the podcast through YouTube, this particular episode, you can find the email address in the YouTube description. Okay, so we need a venue, and then I am also thinking about running either this very podcast or a parallel podcast in which I might need a co-host to come on board. So that's request number 2. If you know of someone who would make a very fantastic co-host for the show, do hit me up on email as well. So those are the 2 requests. Now the third request is a bit more lengthy, and that's regarding a couple of topics that I've got I guess lined up for the next couple of weeks. And what I'd like from you is just to get a bit of feedback. Are these topics that would interest you? Are these topics that you think would really cause a bit of a debate, a conversation? Because what we do here is create engaging conversations around tourism, conservation, travel, and I said a bit of music and tech from time to time. So I'll go through the topics. 2 requests. I'd like you to let me know if any of the topics are quite engaging. And then secondly, I'd like you to also share with me potential candidates, potential names, potential guests that we could have on the podcast for those particular episodes. So I have the topics listed here. I'm not going to prove to be a smart head and just get them off my head. So I'll just skim through them and give a bit of a background, or call it notion, of why those particular topics were decided on. So firstly, I'd like to do an episode on community and conservation. I know we did an episode a couple of weeks back that was with Evelyn from Ride for a Woman, but that was particularly to do with community conservation around the gorillas. So we were basically talking about the interaction between the community in Buhoma, which is one of the it's one of the sectors, I believe, in Bwindi Impenetrable National Park. And we were looking at the interaction between gorillas and the community. We titled it Gorillas in Our Midst. If you've not listened to that particular episode, please go and listen to it. So that's one topic that I'd like to pick up on. But now I want to expand it a bit more towards, I guess, stretch it further than just the gorillas towards several other protected areas that we can sample and see how to discuss a bit about the interaction between the community. Because there's usually a bit of strife between communities and the wildlife, but also there are win-win situations as well. So we'd like to cover a bit of that. Then I also want to do a topic on solo travel. So if you are a solo traveler, or if you know someone who is a solo traveler, please hit me up. I'd be interested to have someone who can come onto the show and share a bit of their experience as a solo traveler, and also share some tips here and there. Then we did an episode with Winnie Rioba from Kenya, who you might know from Just Rioba, the Just Rioba way. And I'd like to pick up on that conversation and expand it a bit further. That was a conversation on intra-African travel. So if you are an expert in that field, if you know someone who is going to add value to the conversation, please do let me know. I'd like to do a topic on climate rebellion. Now, you guys, I'm sure, do see a bit of, if I could call them campaigns. We have quite a vocal Ugandan, Vanessa Nakate, one of our own, who is doing quite a bit in the climate, I call it climate rebellion, climate campaigns. So I'd like to have a conversation around how those campaigns, I guess, being a force for change, force for good. And also, I think it would be nice to also do a bit of criticism. Not criticism, critiquing is the word I was looking for. So if you know a climate expert or maybe someone who is very passionate about that topic, please let me know. Send me an email. I'll be very glad to engage. And I guess, as I said, the conversations we want to have on this podcast should be high-value conversations. I do want to do a topic on inaccessible destinations. Inaccessible versus accessible destinations. Now, let me just explain this a bit. So, inaccessible, if you work in the tourism sector, you might know that accessible destinations are basically destinations where which I guess cater for everyone. So this particular episode would focus on destinations that make it easy for people who have what I call reduced mobility. Now, the world calls them people with disability, which I do not believe is the case, because they have a huge potential and they can do a whole lot. I feel like it's just a matter of reduced mobility. So I would like to do a conversation about that. I guess spotlight a few lodges, spotlight a few tour companies, spotlight a few destinations that have enabled or allowed for these people to access the destinations easily, freely, and comfortably as well. So if you know an expert in the issue of reduced mobility, the issue of accessible destinations, please do let me know. I'd like to do an episode on that. I also want to do an episode on wellness holiday experiences. Okay, so wellness is basically a niche. I don't know if it's a niche or it's just a subsection in the tourism sector. And it's been trending quite a bit. So I'd like to see how the wellness, I shouldn't call it a sector, but that wellness thing is performing in the region, East African region, but also on the African continent as well. So if you are an expert in wellness holiday experiences, please hit me up in the email. I'd be glad to have you on the show and explore that interesting conversation. I'd like to do a topic, or call it an episode, on plants of the gods. Now, this is me just basically doing a bit of deep dive into the herbs, the traditional way in which our forefathers used to treat themselves. So if you are an expert or if you know an expert in that field, I do not intend to spook anyone, but when we were up in Elgon, in Mount Elgon, we had quite an interesting conversation around the spiritual world, especially the African Traditional Society. So I'd be looking to do a bit of a follow-up of that conversation and do a deep dive into the plants of the gods, as I'm calling them, like how people used to treat themselves back then. I think that would be an interesting conversation. So do let me know if you are that expert or if you know someone who is an expert. Now, the neighbor just began drilling. I don't know why, but we will just have to keep going. Then, that's what happens when you are recording in your home space. Sometimes the neighbor's dog is barking. Sometimes the kids are making noise, but we'll just have to keep on going. I also want to do a conversation on people-centric people-centric conservation. Now, this is basically us sampling I guess people who are doing incredible work in the world of conservation and then talking, or rather having a story around them as well. So if you know someone who is, I guess, out of the ordinary, has a unique story, conservation story, do hit me up on email. I'd be glad to spotlight some of those. Then I'm also thinking of doing an episode on the trials and tribulations of being a safari guide. So I've had a bit of an exchange with some tour guides, and they have some interesting stories. So if you are a tour guide, or if you know a tour guide that has some interesting stories, be it incredible sightings, be it the stress of having some clients. I know some clients can be a stress. It could be some life-threatening experiences in the bush. I already have some names in mind, but if you do have someone who you think would add to the conversation, bring value to the conversation, please do let me know. Then I'm also thinking of doing a podcast on the exotic pet trade. Now, in the exotic pet trade, I'm sampling out the lions, the parrots, and the monkeys, which are basically the majority of the animals that I see people flaunting on social media, people posing with, taking selfies, hugging, basically pets that people have in their homes that are meant to be wild animals. So I know I had scheduled a conversation with, what are these guys called? Wild Animal Protection, that's WAP. Maybe I'd like to pick up on that discussion and just follow up on them. And then also, if you guys think of anyone else that would bring value to that conversation, please do let me know. That's a conversation on pets. Must apologize, the neighbor is drilling, so we'll have to keep going. Then I'm thinking of doing a topic on the dark world of illegal wildlife trade. Now that's going to be a hardcore conservation piece. And I think we'll have to have some experts on, maybe a representative from the Wildlife Authority, some guys from the hardcore conservation world to discuss this interesting and also usually sticky subject of illegal wildlife trade. If you are an illegal wildlife trader and you are you are quite brave and bold enough to come on the show, well, mine is a free space. I'd be very glad or very happy to have you on, as to have a bit of a conversation as well. So if you do know an expert in this field, illegal wildlife trade, please do hit me up. And if you are that expert as well, I'd be glad to have you on. I'm also thinking of doing an episode on baby rhinos and the fight to conserve the rhino species. Of course, just the other week I was reading about rhinos being born at Ziwa Rhino Sanctuary. And I'd like to pick up on that conversation around the babies of the wild, particularly the young baby rhinos, and would like to have a conversation on that. If you are a rhino conservationist, rhino expert, hit me up on the email or maybe the DM as well. I'd like to have a conversation on that as well. Then I'm also thinking about doing a discussion on conservation in conflict zones. I've already reached out to someone in Congo, in the Virunga National Park. Of course, that's an area that's really been hit with civil strife and unrest. So I'd like to explore the discussion of how conservation is a challenge in those conflict zones, and maybe how conservation is, if I could call it, a sense of hope, or it brings hope to people in those destinations. So if you are someone who has a bit of knowledge around, or maybe who's worked in a conflict zone in the conservation space, please do let me know. I'd be glad to bring you onto the show. Okay, I'm also thinking about doing an episode on seeking safety in the Land Cruiser and Land Rover. Now, this is basically going to be an episode of us getting a bit of history around where safari vehicles began, how they've evolved over the years, how they've created this shell that is usually a perfect environment, or a perfect box that transports tourists maybe from the airport to the wilderness, or maybe takes them around the different protected areas. It's often forgotten. It's often not given the praise that it deserves. And I'd like to basically do a bit of a conversation on that. Thinking of bringing on Satbir from Hans Paul. But if there's any other person that you think would add to that conversation, Hans Paul are basically the guys in Tanzania who, they call it what? Modify Land Cruisers into what we know as safari vehicles. So Satbir would be one really interesting gentleman to bring on. But if there's anyone else that you guys think of, do let me know. I'm thinking of doing a conversation on the world's most trafficked animal, which, if you didn't know, is the pangolin. So I'd like to do an episode around that. It's an animal that most people do not know. It's an animal that goes pretty much unknown so many times. So if you are an expert in pangolins, if you are a conservationist that's doing a bit of research, if you are someone who has some interesting information about pangolins and the trade around them, please hit me up on email. I'd be glad to have that conversation. Then I'm also interested in doing a conversation on gorilla conservation. Now, I already have a piece scheduled with the gorilla doctors, but I'd like to do something that has the gorilla doctors and maybe 2 other conservationists as well, particularly to discuss the topic of gorilla conservation. Maybe I'll think about bringing on Dr. Seguya from the Greater Virunga Transboundary Collaboration to at least give it a bit of a wider scope than just the Ugandan setting. So if you know anyone else, again, let me know. And if you are that person, please hit me up. I'd be glad to have you on the show. I'd also like to do an episode on rhino horn trading to save. Now, the notion behind that is this discussion in South Africa, rather Southern Africa, the Southern African countries, where there's an activity where they dehorn rhinos. So I'd like to dig deep into how that is being done, but also to ask the question of where does the horn go after it's dehorned off the rhino? So if you are an expert in that field, if you've done a bit of research, if you know someone who is very knowledgeable around the dehorning campaign, I don't know if it's a campaign or it's an activity, let me know. Hit me up on email. I'd be glad to have a conversation. Hunters and poachers, what's the difference? That's another episode I'd like to do. I know we did an episode around trophy hunting, where I had quite an interesting discussion with, we call them professional hunters. He was a professional hunter from Sweden. And I also had a hardcore conservationist from HSI, which is Humane Society International, one of the biggest conservation NGOs on the planet. And we were battling or debating why trophy hunting is done. What's the whole notion behind it? Is it really conservation? If you've not listened to that episode, please go listen to it. It's currently our most streamed episode on the show. I believe you'll enjoy it. You might also leave a bit annoyed, but well, that's what we create here. We create a space where people come and share, come and provide their side of the picture, and yeah, that's what motivates me to keep creating. Just create a safe space for people to come and share and engage. So I'd like to do a topic on, as I said, the difference between those professional hunters and what we call poachers in Africa. Why would you have someone come here and hunt our animals, but then you lock up someone who is doing the same thing, and these people contributing to the same, or rather causing a similar challenge to the wild? That's a discussion I'd like to have. Let me know if you are interested in jumping onto that conversation. I also want to do an episode on wild meat, or call it bush meat. So if you know someone who runs a restaurant or someone who has experience in bush meat, let me know. I'd like to have a discussion on that. How we roll it out, that is for me to keep to myself, the detail of that conversation. But I bet you not, it will be, I kid you not, it will be a very interesting conversation. I also want to do a follow-up episode of an episode we did with a couple of friends of mine, awesome people. It was a conversation on conservation storytelling, where we kind of just hit a bit of we just tapped a bit of the surface, but I'd like us to do a further deep dive into that conversation to get a bit more detail on conservation storytelling. Who are the guys doing it? What are the case studies of where it's having huge impact? What are those notable those notable creatives that are worth spotlighting. What lessons can we learn? How can we do it better? How can we do it more? That's a discussion that I'd want to have as a follow-up of that episode that we did, I think 2 weeks back. If you've not listened to it, please go listen to it. I also want to do a conversation titled On Borrowed Time. Now, this is basically me inviting guys on to discuss the urgency of climate storytelling. I've been interested in doing a couple of climate stories for film and photo, and I feel like it's an interesting area that's not, I guess, highlighted enough, especially from a point of view where a local layman like you and me would understand. The climate discussion seems to be a lot of, if I could call it, an elitist discussion. It's way high in the clouds, and there is need to really bring it down for the local man to kind of understand. It also needs to be told through a local voice like you and me. So I'd like to have that discussion. If you know someone who is a climate storyteller or someone who has a bit of knowledge around that, please hit me up. Then second last but not least, I'd like to do a conversation on why environmental conservation won't save nature. Now, as wrong as that might sound to you, I want to explore that. I've had a conversation with some people who, I guess, advocate more for, they call it sustainable use of resources. So people like trophy hunters, people like professional hunters who say, let's shoot a few animals, but then pay a huge chunk of money to support conservation of the bigger herd. Then you have people who really advocate for replanting, people who advocate for breeding of animals, so that we can conserve a species that is maybe really threatened by survival. And then you have on the other side people who say, no, do not touch the planet, leave it to regenerate, leave it to recover on its own. So those are the two fields, and that's a kind of debate that I'd like to have. The guys that say, okay, we can help the earth recover. And then the guys who say, no, let the earth recover on its own. And why I've titled it, why conservation may not save the earth or may not save nature, is because my understanding is the environment or nature takes millions and millions of years to regenerate. So I'd like the conservationists to tell me how or which practical solutions they are offering to help us conserve nature that, I guess, throw off the discussion of those guys who are promoting, they call it sustainable use of resources. Then finally, just this week, I was having a chat with a guest who was on the podcast. That's Dr. Matthew from South Africa. And he highlighted he brought up an interesting story around the forest elephants. Now, Uganda is one of the few countries that are fortunate to have the African forest elephants. I've actually been fortunate to see them in Bwindi, the Ruhija sector. A couple of friends of mine have seen them in Chibale as well. I've never seen them in Chibale, not been lucky. But I'd like to do, what Dr. Matthew was saying is that those elephants help in the process of carbon sequestration. Now, that's quite a heavy term for people who normal people like you and me. Carbon sequestration is basically the way in which forests or maybe elements of the ecosystem help absorb carbon, the carbon dioxide we create, and reduce the carbon in the air, which in turn helps us in reducing greenhouse gases and also reducing global warming. So what Dr. Matthew was saying is that these forest elephants actually help in that process of carbon sequestration. And what he was saying is the elephants, these particular elephants, are unfortunately under a huge threat. I think they're critically endangered. So I'd like to, that kind of tickled my mind towards a discussion around how we need to conserve their environment, or rather their habitat, the forest elephants, how we need to conserve them, and in turn help and contribute to our fight to reduce greenhouse gases and help the environment in the process of carbon sequestration. I'm a bit stressed with my neighbor mowing, but nothing to do. But with that said, those are the topics I'm looking at. So as I said, I need help with identifying a venue. I need help with identifying a co-host. Of course, for the times I'm on the road, it's good for the show to keep going. Then I also need help with, or rather feedback on some of those topics, and also help with identifying some guests. Yeah, so I'd like to once again thank you all for tuning in. I thank you all for streaming the show, streaming the podcast. It's been a while since I last said welcome back to my YouTube channel. Yeah, but I've been busy. I guess that's a good thing, a good and bad thing. Yeah, but as we work towards making this a video podcast, I'd like to make this a bit more engaging, a bit more of a community effort. You guys share feedback. I share some of my thoughts, share some thoughts of friends, and we see how to make this an interesting space. If you've not listened to the podcast yet, I'd like to remind you that the podcast is available on all streaming platforms, all major streaming platforms. We are available on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Where else are we? Spotify. For guys tuning in the US, we are available on iHeartRadio, which very few creatives are on. I'm quite fortunate to be on iHeartRadio. We're also available on Castbox, Deezer, Pandora, and if I'm forgetting any other platform, I'll just say all other streaming platforms. Yeah, so do let me know. Share a bit of feedback. I'd be very glad to look at it over the next coming weeks. And yeah, that's me letting you into behind the scenes of how the show is going to evolve over the next coming weeks. And those topics should help us walk this journey. And maybe, as I did mention, that yes, the show has been doing very well. It's been high up the charts. And the only way we can keep it high up the charts is if you guys recommend the show, is if you keep streaming it. But I also want to encourage more creatives to come into this space of podcasting for travel, podcasting for conservation, because yes, I'm one voice, but if we had a couple of voices, we would be able to advance these messages and spread the story further, spread the messages further, have an even bigger impact if we joined hands, if we had a couple more voices, especially local voices. I'm a proponent of African stories told by indigenous Africans. So let's encourage more creatives to dive into this podcast space, which is still a bit nascent in Uganda and also in Africa. But I feel like it's going to pick up. No beef for radio. I think people should still listen to the radio, but I feel like the podcast space is one of those spaces that is still going to become huge in the next coming months, years. And of course, there are gains as well for people who want to monetize as well. I've been able to not to spill too many beans. I've been able to get some deals, some invitations to speak, of course paid arrangements. So there is a win-win at both sides of it. So I do not want to be the only one at the top of the charts. I'd like to have a few more creatives as well join the conversation. All right, I'm done blabbing, and I'll apologize again for my neighbor mowing. It's what happens when you are recording in your home space. But I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you all for the support. And as we say, I guess I'll have to see you in the next one.